everybody, and welcome back to the Tipping Point with Finstep Asia, looking at the tipping point for climate change through fintech. Last time we spoke to Simon from Handpin talking about how they are looking to offset carbon footprint on shopping. We are going to now be talking to Aiaze Mitha, who will also build on that concept. Aiaze, welcome to the Tipping Point. How are you doing today?
Thank you, Musheer. I'm doing fantastic, and I'm very excited to be here with you.
Thank you. Aiaze and I are on the board of the Global Impact Fintech Forum, but more importantly, Aiaze is a sustainability and fintech expert. He's leading a joint initiative at the UN with the UNDP and UNCDF on fintech and the SDGs. Very, very interesting. Sustainability is at the heart of what he does, and technology is what's driving it. So we're looking forward to this conversation, Aiaze. I want to start off with you just maybe introducing to our audience what have you seen, and I like to compare and see changes, right? That's something that interests me always, or intrigues me. In the last 5 to 7 years, how have you seen the industry respond to SDGs and sustainability from a fintech perspective? From you've been around for quite some time in this space, but what has changed in the last 3 to 7 years?
Thanks, Musheer. I think there's definitely a shift that you can actually see in the market. I think fintech entrepreneurs are more and more responsible, more and more receptive to the climate agenda, for instance, and the nature and biodiversity agenda. They realize that to achieve the SDGs, everybody needs to really bring joint forces and get together, and that fintech innovation can actually really have a transformative and transformational impact on reaching that agenda. And so you're really seeing a major shift in the industry, with a lot of fintech entrepreneurs actually designing solutions to address some of our SDG concerns and challenges, but also on the environmental concerns and challenges. And you see a similar shift in the VC and early stage investment space. If you just look at climate tech, for instance, between June of 2020 and June of 2021, there's actually been about almost $90 billion poured into that sector, 87.5 or something $billion, which was probably a 200% increase compared to the previous period. So you see on the one hand, investors really putting in a lot of money into that space. And you see also then a whole new industry and a whole new area of innovation actually emerging from the fintech space into the climate space, for example. So there's definitely a key trend that we can see there.
That's great. Look, you've seen this space for a while, as I mentioned previously. What I want to jump right into is to talk about that conversation we were having around how consumption is a major element, right? The planet is closer to 10 billion people than ever before, and we're racing towards it almost. Well, on the other side, we're seeing extreme climate events increase. But from a consumption perspective and fintech perspective, you have some very interesting thoughts. Could you please share that with us?
Yeah, so in fact, about 2/3 of carbon emissions globally are directly or indirectly linked to human consumption and consumption choices. If you look at food waste, for instance, that's responsible for 6% of greenhouse gas emissions. If you look at household energy consumption, that's responsible for 21% of carbon emissions. If you look at mobility and the way we actually move around, commute to work and move around in cities, that's responsible for 21% of greenhouse gas emissions. And then, of course, demand for food, and there's many other examples, right? Sure. And so consumption is a key driver of climate change and biodiversity loss. And so one might ask the question, can we do something about it? And one of the interesting things that's happening in the fintech space is that e-commerce platforms are actually stepping up to the game. And one of the initiatives that I am currently involved in focuses on innovation at the e-commerce platform level, using fintech innovations to actually engage e-commerce shoppers on making greener choices and more carbon neutral, nature positive purchases. And so that obviously encompasses everything from accounting, first of all, what's the carbon content and the nature content of the products that you purchase online, all the way to engaging you through the types of narratives that you're going to be responsive to, whether it's a positive narrative by making X purchase, I've avoided such amount of carbon emission, for instance, or a negative narrative by purchasing such type of products, I am responsible for such amount of deforestation. So really testing those different narratives, testing incentives to actually get people to shift their behaviors towards greener choices, and really engaging them through fintech and digital innovations. That could mean linking your purchase behavior or experience to your social media accounts, for instance, so that you can actually, in your online communities, engage with your communities and display the kind of sustainable choices that you make. But it could be connecting you to an augmented reality solution, for instance, that allows you to visualize the world that you're actually contributing to creating by making those choices. And it would then translate into more downstream into you, through your green choices, actually generating green points that could be invested into impact projects around conservation, reforestation, etc. So it's really those type of innovations that you're starting to see in the e-commerce space that are extremely promising and exciting.
Thanks. Look, there is one thing I want to ask you is, we have moved from a world where we were looking at financial inclusion as a major focus. It still remains, you have a billion and a half people who probably don't have access to banking, but that's fast changing because of fintech largely looking at elements of just plain simple mobile wallets which have reduced KYC needs and the building of the digital ID. Where I'm going with this is, one of the things we've started to notice is a bit of differentiation, or where we're having a lack of technology inclusion, right? In the sense there's being a disparity almost, where the haves have much better technology to deal with and the have-nots do not have that technology, right? A classic case that I always remember was I think the co-founder of Ola was talking about why Ola cabs in India did so much better than Uber, and I'm just building the story around this. The main reason was Uber was built for 3G in India, while in many parts of India you could not get more than 2.5G, right? So what Ola did was they built for 2.5G and 3G. So in a lot of the interior parts of India and tier 2, tier 3 India, and this is a story of 3-4 years ago, when we were only at 300 million or 400 million people with access to internet in India. And they found a lot more drivers and a lot more users because it was working for them. It was 2.5G and it was much better for them as an experience than Uber, which was, because a lot of people where drivers would have both Uber and Ola. That was very, very standard in India. So that's an example of building for something that caters to the broader market and rather than chasing. So the technology disparity is one thing. So I'm coming to that now, being that over the first thing you get when in financial services is payments, right? And that was what drove mobile payments in China. And then e-commerce was, one of the fundamental reasons for Alipay to build out was so that they can have their e-commerce play, right? And have a payment service for that. And that's where the root of modern day mobile payments essentially comes from. But now what the problem is, if with a lot of people coming online now, right? I gave the example of India where internet has doubled in numbers over the last 3 years. Similar examples in many parts of Southeast Asia and Africa where numbers have significantly increased. People are looking to purchase more on e-commerce platforms, right? But so if the consumption is definitely likely to increase, but are they able to get these options as well, or are these more, for a lack of a better word, niche or for a limited audience?
So I think, obviously, first of all, the technology gap exists. There's good news and bad news. The good news is that there's some sort of convergence on basic technology capabilities around the world. So, access to basic connectivity with a basic mobile phone, for instance. And the more advanced capabilities, both in terms of skills and more advanced technologies, are diverging. And so obviously there's a lot of focus and investment in making sure that converges as well, that everybody has access to it. Now, the kind of innovation that I was actually referring to on e-commerce obviously requires a certain level of sophistication of the market and a certain level of digitalization of the economy. So the typical example I was giving is really something I'm working right now across Southeast Asia and South Asia to an extent, in markets that are more digital savvy, if you would like. That would be applicable to a place like Brazil, which is also extremely active on the digital side and with very high proficiency of users around social media and engagement with the internet, etc. Obviously, in other markets, it would be more difficult. But what's possible, though, independent of the technology divide, which needs to be addressed, is that e-commerce platforms and others have ways of engaging their users through very sophisticated engagement models using digital tools, but they can also engage them offline. You could, in contexts where you don't have access to all these digital tools, you can always mobilize your users as a payment platform or as an e-commerce platform to get together and clean a park or to clean a beach and do some other types of activities, even recycling activities of your handheld devices or other things that could actually really help you move towards more sustainability. So if you look at Indonesia, for example, there's a lot of examples where payment platforms are actually helping local communities to recycle material, to be creative in actually building new type of craft with recycled materials, and then they give them sort of an opportunity to display their goods and their products through an online shopping kind of window through which they can actually sell their products and get paid for it. And so in many different ways, there's different levels at which you can engage. It could be very sophisticated in highly digitalized environments and less sophisticated, perhaps more offline in others, but you can actually start moving along that journey. So I would say that's starting to happen and that should be happening globally.
It's very fascinating. I had not heard of that, and I think it's a wonderful example, the Indonesian example you gave, where people are being encouraged to recycle, and then so it's about incentivization, right? But one of the key elements is in markets like Southeast Asia, especially, is the community aspect, right? So are you seeing fintechs beyond this example, any other community elements that they're trying to drive to help sustainability?
Yeah, of course. So obviously it goes back to how do we make choices, right? Do we make choices in a reflective way, in a non-reflective way? Do we need to target a combination of both?
Sure.
If you look at the case of most carbon calculators in the market today, they essentially use sort of the reflective side of your neural system. They provide you with information that you can analyze and you can make a decision based on that. But there's also non-reflective dimensions in terms of how we make choices spontaneously. And you could actually powerfully combine these two and also combine that sense of socialization and the network effects, but also the reinforcing of online identities that come through socialization. So if you look at, for instance, the example of Ant Forest in China, Ant Forest has precisely designed a model to drive green actions of their users in a way that is really engaging through social interaction on an online platform that drives a lot of engagement around using green points, planting trees in a virtual forest, all sorts of things. And those social elements are actually starting to come into play in different ways. You even have it sort of at a totally different level. If you're using any sort of fitness tracker app, which is something totally different now, but you would see that you're able to actually compare yourself with your friends. You're able to track how many steps you've taken today, or you've walked today, and what your other friends and family members have done. You can actually have challenges. So this sort of social element is inherent to the way in which we live today in a connected society. And it's starting to actually be also harnessed to create that broader movement, if you would like, towards more sustainable choices and actions.
Right, I think that Ant, I mean, I don't know, we're coming back to, so for the audience who may not know, Ant Forest is essentially an initiative of the Ant Group, the financial services / fintech arm of Alibaba, where they're helping plant trees based on consumption and, people contributing towards it in terms of an offset, as it were. And there's one interesting element of the 11/11 day. So it's called the Singles Day in mainland China, where you see the highest amount of e-commerce sales anywhere in the world. And they've been consistently breaking records in the last 5-6 years, where Alibaba alone sells more than all of Black Friday combined. So this year was over 70, I think it was $90 billion. And you had JD.com doing a significant amount of, I think, close to $50 billion sales over a 10-day period. And however, typically Alibaba would show the numbers of how much sales they have done, but this year they focused on just sustainability, trying to talk more about the amount of initiatives they're driving towards sustainability. So we're seeing that. But I'm going to build towards my next question, which is a lot of it is also driven by retail participants. Consumers are pushing towards it, and Ant Forest is another example where there's a high amount of consumer participation. And could you talk us a little bit more about green bonds or other instruments that are available where we're seeing a higher engagement of retail participants in the recent times?
Yeah, so that might take us in a slightly different direction, but I was mentioning, so consumption obviously is one major area. Retail investments in general, without talking about specific instruments, is another major area. If you just look at the daily trading, the daily market trading volumes attributable to retail and private investors, they're on average about 30% around the world, maybe 50% in the US. So that shows you the amount of power that retail investors have to actually move the needle in terms of sustainability, whether they invest in different types of funds, whether they invest in specific instruments like green bonds and others. And so in that space, there's also a movement using fintech innovations for accounting for the ESG performance of different financial instruments to actually start engaging retail investors on their investment choices. There's a recent survey that was done globally that shows that about 84% of retail investors, at least in the US, are actually interested in sustainability investment products. And there was a global survey that was showing that 77% of retail investors wouldn't actually invest against their values if they had a proper representation and accounting for the nature and climate impact of their investments. And not just nature and climate, but also, of course, gender equality, human rights, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a huge wave of fintech innovation in that space in terms of footprinting and accounting for being able to actually measure the ESG performance of specific funds, and then under those funds of specific companies that are part of the fund, and also in engaging users to actually make greener or choices that are more aligned with their values and their preferences and their interests, if you would like. So that's another huge area in which we are going to see a major shift in the coming years.
Yeah, I'm just gonna give a shout out to the Genesis project, which was developed by the BIS Innovation Hub along with HKMA and others here in Hong Kong, which essentially was looking to tokenize the green bond, right? The Hong Kong government has a massive sustainability and green finance agenda. So this was a pilot to showcase that you could essentially break this down into very affordable chunks, and purchases could be done as good as tapping our Octopus card, which is the most dominant and one of the first tap and go cards in the world, right? Moving on from there and then building on from there from a consumption perspective, we're also talking about the values that you were talking about and the unintended consequences. The term that you used about elephants, I'll let you quote it because I think that is a very relevant quote that you put about that, and love to know hear thoughts from a fintech technology perspective, how that impacts and can be used.
So I think, Musheer, first of all, there's a realization, and that's happened also at COP26 in Glasgow, by the way, that the climate agenda is very much connected to the nature agenda. One cannot solve for climate if we don't solve for nature and biodiversity in many ways. And so with that understanding, we're starting to see a number of fintechs getting into that space as well, looking at biodiversity and nature in many different ways. And I think one of the very promising and interesting angles is, how do you actually create nature markets? One of the challenges we have today is that there isn't such an understanding in our economic model around the value of nature and living biodiversity. Actually, we attach more value to a dead tree because of what you produce with it than to a living tree over the lifespan of a tree. So if you take the example of an elephant, which is something I mentioned to you, there's a market for a dead elephant for its ivory, and a dead elephant for its ivory is basically worth $40,000 in the market. A living elephant, if you look at the carbon sequestration capabilities of the elephant, if you look at the ecosystem services that it actually renders in the savannah, maintaining the savannah, destroying or eating the acacia trees and making sure that a savannah remains a grassland, if you measure and draw an economic model that's going to tell you the value of all these ecosystem services, the value of an elephant compared to a dead elephant, which is worth $40,000, the value of a living elephant over a lifespan of 60 years would be $1.75 million. Okay. Now, what if you could securitize it? What if you could define it, first of all? So of course you need to track it, measure it, etc. And how if you could securitize it into a new asset class that could be designed on the blockchain, on a DLT type of platform that could attract international financial capital markets, but also corporate investments and even retail user investments into a token, which would be some sort of nature eco token, whatever you want to name it, which would have an equivalent in terms of carbon credits. And you were able to trade that in formal carbon markets. That kind of model that now starts really evaluating and valuing the potential impact of a living biodiversity, call it an elephant, a tree, or any sort of keystone species, to allow in ways that allow people to capture the value of that into an economic model that allows financing of these conservation and restoration efforts, in addition to supporting offsetting as well, could be revolutionary in the way we actually embed that into our current models. And this is starting to be designed and starting to be developed right now by multiple players that I've come across in recent months. And it's actually very, very promising. It's a whole new area of exploration that will really change the way we relate to these topics and the way we actually start supporting conservation efforts, and at the same time shifting our entire economy towards a much carbon light, nature positive, responsible model, if you would like.
No, I think I'm just shaking my head, just fascinated by these insights. The value going up by 40 times, right? You're not just talking about from 40,000 to 1.7 million, right? And a lot of people just look at wild animals, it's Nat Geo, it's World Wildlife Federation and others from that perspective. But here's an actual economic model that shows not just from, it's not about just having animals, it's about what impact it has on the earth and on the future of our whole ecosystem, right? And interestingly enough, I think the securitization element could be very useful, and tokenization, so that people could get a piece of an elephant for a lifetime, right? And a lot of people have been looking at projects from a permanence, from a long-term carbon credit perspective, but largely focused on nature from a trees biodiversity perspective, but not from a animal perspective. So this is are there any companies you know of or can name that or any initiatives that you're running?
So I am not running personally any initiative related to that, but there's a few organizations. One of them is called Rebalance Earth. That's actually focusing on designing this in the context of elephants, and they're looking at targeting other keystone species as well. But really as a way to, as a mechanism to provide that valuation of what a living biodiversity actually means to us, and being able to bring that into a financial instrument in the form of a tokenized asset that allows for financing and easy financing into this. And of course, then you need to create linkages into carbon markets, etc. So that involves a whole process of third-party verification and all sorts of things. But you could actually create those linkages so that then people can actually use that, companies, organizations can actually also use that for offsetting. But I think that the beauty of it is that it makes people realize how important, and even though we knew it intuitively, how important nature is and how important living biodiversity is. But beyond knowing it in our hearts, once you start actually putting an economic model, you're starting to allow financial flows to actually come into it. You're starting to allow greater consideration of that into financial decision-making processes. And that is going to be a game changer in terms of how now we are seeing, first, how we are investing in it, but also how we are potentially penalizing companies that are destroying it in many different ways. And so that will completely change even how organizations and companies are going to be relating to those issues in the future.
Well, it's been very fascinating listening to all the three examples and cases. Have something that's so much to take in. Any final thoughts or anything that you would like to end with? Just talking about what can be done specifically from fintech companies to be part of this change. What would you suggest or advise fintech firms? How can they go about it?
So I think, I was myself a fintech entrepreneur in the past, many years ago. And now that I reflect back on it, I think, first of all, there's that awareness in this generation of entrepreneurs. So it's not like we need to create the awareness. The awareness is there. They're actually building solutions for addressing this. I think my main advice would be, don't lose sight of that impact and that thing that you're trying to achieve in the world and that legacy you're trying to leave in the world. There will be a lot of investors that will be willing to back you for that vision, not just for returns and a sort of short-term financial profits and benefits, but there's investors that are now ready to actually back you for this longer-term vision about protecting the planet. That's going to be immensely valued, including in the corporate space. And so I would say it's an important driver that everybody should actually really hold on to very, very strongly. And there's a lot of solutions that can be built. And now in that ecosystem, I was mentioning that tokenization of, but then what does it mean? It means you need to be able to actually track and measure that your biodiversity is thriving. So you need to start building solutions around drones, IoTs, remote sensing, satellite imagery capabilities. You need to be able to process these. You need to be able to actually engage people around that. And of course, we are all getting excited about new developments like NFTs, etc. Now you can easily imagine that NFTs could be moved beyond the art sector and art industry or the sports industry into that kind of space to support new layers of models on these endeavors to drive sustainability. And so whatever your fintech interests are, there's a nature element to it, there's a biodiversity, there's a planet element to it. And if we all want to live peacefully on a healthy planet in a few years from now, I won't be there anymore, but many others will be there, hopefully. You can actually contribute to building it, and you can actually contribute through your solutions to advancing this. And that would be the best possible thing you could do in your life. So I would really encourage everyone to pursue that path. And I would be totally happy to support in any way I can.
Thank you so much for that offer to the entrepreneurial ecosystem. From looking at people who want to go to the Mars, and there's nothing wrong with it, but we have one planet that survived for thousands of years or billions of years in a way that we can also be part of it, and that's a challenge, and that's a goal that we can try leaving a legacy which will impact our future generations. Aiaze, fascinating conversation from consumption all the way to conservation. Thanks again for joining us, and I look forward to continuing our conversation there. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the opportunity. It was a great pleasure for me. Thanks, Musheer, and thanks everyone. Bye-bye.